Over 4 decades ago, a series of disappearances and murders shattered this quiet community. Young lives vanished, bodies were found, and questions lingered. Who could be responsible for the deaths of Kristi, Brandy, and others? Is the killer still out there, hidden in plain sight? Today, we dive deep into one of the most haunting mysteries of the Pacific Northwest, the Lewis Clark Valley murders. Secrets, suspects, and a hunt for justice. This is a story you won't forget. The year was 1979. Nestled between Idaho and Washington, the peaceful Lewis Clark Valley had its first taste of horror when a string of young people started vanishing. The community was small, close-knit, and the terror that would soon sweep across it was unimaginable. Our story begins with Kristi David, 14 years old. Full of life, she was last seen on June 26, 1981, walking near the 1500 block of 11th Avenue in Lewiston, Idaho. She was just a teenager, with friends, family, and dreams. But that night, Kristi didn't make it home. For weeks, her family waited, searching tirelessly, hoping she'd walk through the door. But Kristi David was never seen again. She was the first of many, and her disappearance was only the beginning. Just 2 months later, another young girl vanished without a trace. 12-year-old Kristen Smart. She was last seen on her way to a friend's house, a quick trip on a familiar route in a familiar town. Kristen was bright, kind, and full of promise, but like Kristi, she simply vanished into the night. The community reeled from these disappearances, and parents kept their children close, fearful that there might be a predator among them. But despite their efforts, fear wasn't enough to keep the darkness away. Stephen Pearsall, a local theater worker and friend to Kristen and Brandy, was the next to disappear. On the night of September 12, 1982, he planned to work late at the Lewiston Civic Theater. Friends saw him at the theater that night, and he was never seen again. What linked these disappearances? The police and investigators were desperate to find connections, clues, anything that might explain why these young people were vanishing. Then came Brandy Miller, a 16-year-old girl who was last seen at the Lewiston Civic Theater. She and her friend, Christina Nelson, had gone there on September 12th, the same night Stephen disappeared. The theater was supposed to be a safe place, a gathering point. Instead, it became the last place anyone saw them alive. The police struggled, combing through the theater, neighborhoods, and the valley itself. But there was no evidence. It was as if these young people had vanished into thin air. Days turned into months, and the families of Kristi, Kristen, Stephen, and Brandy were left waiting, caught between hope and despair, their lives forever shadowed by a mystery that seemed to have no end. In October 1984, 2 years after Brandy's disappearance, 2 hunters found human remains in a ravine near Kendrick, Idaho. The discovery horrified the community once again, rearing questions, but bringing no answers. The remains were identified as those of Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller, victims whose fates had been concealed for years. But as shocking as the discovery was, the mystery only deepened, leaving a chilling question unanswered. Who did this? Fear gripped the valley as families realized there was likely a killer in their midst. Someone who knew their town, their streets, and, worse yet, perhaps even their children. Rumors began to circulate. Some residents believed that the killer might be among them, a neighbor, a friend, someone they saw every day. And yet, the police had no concrete suspects. The quiet peace of the valley had been shattered, and a dark cloud loomed over it, casting doubt, fear, and endless questions that still haunt it to this day. As the years went by, theories began to emerge about who might be responsible for the disappearances and murders in the Lewis Clark Valley. But one name surfaced repeatedly, a man who had connections to both the victims and the theater. His name was Lance Jeffrey Voss. Lance Voss was a teacher, a father, a trusted member of the community. He was known by many, and his presence at the Civic Theater, where Brandy Miller, Christina Nelson, and Stephen Pearsall had last been seen, became a focus of intense scrutiny. Rumors swirled. Some claimed Voss had been seen near the locations where victims vanished. Others whispered about his strange behaviors. But the evidence was thin, and Voss maintained his innocence, never charged with any crime related to the disappearances. Despite a lack of concrete evidence, the police began focusing their investigation on him. Friends of Voss defended him, insisting he was a victim of circumstance. The community was divided, with some convinced he was innocent and others convinced he held the answers to their darkest questions. The police conducted interviews, gathered statements, and questioned him repeatedly, but with no hard evidence, no witness, and no physical proof linking him to the crimes. The case remained stalled. As the years passed, families of the victims were forced to grapple with the haunting realization that they might never see justice. The valley remained a place of uneasy silence, marked by rumors and suspicion. Kristi David, Kristen Smart, and Stephen Pierce all were still missing. The remains of Christina Nelson and Brandy Miller offered some closure, but no real answers. The killer, it seemed, had outwitted the system, hidden in plain sight. More suspects emerged over the years, each theory bringing its own web of potential connections and disturbing possibilities. Some believed it was a transient killer passing through. Others were certain it was a local who knew the victims well. Years turned to decades, and the families of the victims clung to what little hope remained. Some had left the valley, unable to bear the constant reminders. Others stayed, determined to find closure, determined to bring the truth to light. In recent years, advances in forensic technology and renewed interest in cold cases have given some hope that answers may still be found. But time, as always, is the enemy, and as memories fade, so do the chances of finding hard evidence. The valley itself is quiet now. The theater still stands, its stage empty, a silent reminder of lives cut short. The families and friends of Kristi, Kristen, Stephen, Brandy, and Christina continue to wait, but their patience is mixed with sorrow and a longing for justice. Every anniversary, they gather to remember, to mourn, and to demand answers. To honor the lives lost and keep their memories alive, a painful reminder of the darkness that once touched their valley. Will the killer ever be brought to justice? Will the families ever know the truth of what happened to their loved ones? The answers, if they exist, lie somewhere in the shadows of the Lewis Clark Valley. But for now, the valley is silent, as it has been for years. And until justice is served, the ghosts of the Lewis Clark Valley will continue to linger, their stories waiting to be told.
Welcome back, everyone. We're about to take a deep dive today into a place that proves looks can be deceiving.
Sounds intriguing.
The Lewis Clark Valley, picture-perfect scenery, right?
Yeah.
But beneath that beauty lies a dark history.
Oh.
A string of disappearances and murders that shook the valley back in the late 70s and early 80s.
And you said some are still unsolved.
Some are still unsolved to this day.
It's always unsettling when a place that appears so peaceful harbors such darkness. It really makes you question that sense of safety we often associate with small towns.
Exactly. And today we're going to try to unravel some of that darkness.
Okay.
We're going to talk about Kristi David, Kristen Smart, Stephen Pearsall, Brandy Miller, and Christina Nelson.
5 names, 5 lives, each one a tragedy.
5 lives forever linked by this mystery. So to start, let's rewind back to June 26, 1981.
Okay.
Kristi David, just 14 years old, vanishes.
Vanishes.
Gone. Last seen walking near 11th Avenue in Lewiston, Idaho.
Just gone. No trace.
No trace. And it's details like that, that shatter the illusion of safety, especially for young people.
The parents' worst nightmare, right?
It is, and it makes you question, who to trust and where it's truly safe. Because It's not always the stranger in the dark alley. Statistically, it's often someone the victim knows.
Someone familiar. Someone who betrays that trust.
Yeah, and that thought just adds another layer of fear to these cases. And just 2 months after Kristi disappears, 12-year-old Kristen Smart vanishes as well.
Oh my goodness.
Also in Lewiston, on her way to a friend's house. Imagine the fear that must have gripped the valley.
It's like a ripple effect, isn't it? The fear spreads and suddenly no one feels safe.
And both of these girls, they vanish from ordinary, everyday situation.
Right. It wasn't in some dangerous part of town or late at night.
It was broad daylight.
In the heart of their community.
It's that vulnerability, that sense of nowhere being truly safe that really chills you to the bone.
Absolutely. It makes you question everything. And then a year later, Stephen Pearsall, he worked at the local theater.
Right, the Lewiston Civic Theater.
Disappears on September 12th, 1982.
And here's where things start to get even more complicated. Stephen was actually friends with both Kristen Smart and Brandy Miller.
Wait, so 2 of the missing girls and now this man who disappears, they were all connected.
They were all connected. So we have to ask, is this just a series of tragic coincidences, or is there a more sinister link?
A pattern, perhaps.
A pattern, perhaps. But hold on to that thought, because the story takes another dark turn on that very same night.
The same night, Stephen Pearsall disappeared.
Brandy Miller, 16 years old, and Christina Nelson also vanished.
And they were last seen where?
The Lewiston Civic Theater, the same place Stephen worked. It's almost like the theater, a place meant for creativity and community, suddenly becomes a place of shadows and secrets.
It's so unsettling how a familiar, seemingly safe space can transform into something so sinister.
The Lewiston Civic Theater, a place where these young people shared their passion for the arts, now shrouded in mystery and suspicion. Imagine the community's fear, the questions swirling around.
And for the families, the agony of not knowing, it must have been unbearable.
It must have been. Then 2 years later, October 1984, another devastating blow. Hunters make a grim discovery.
What did they find?
Human remains in a ravine near Kendrick, Idaho, later identified as Brandy Miller and Christina Nelson.
After 2 years of hoping against hope, the families were forced to face the unimaginable.
It's a heartbreaking truth, and the community's fear, I imagine, it intensified.
The killer was still out there.
Right.
Yeah.
And it raised so many more questions. Who was responsible? Was there a connection between all these disappearances?
Were they going to strike again?
Right. The sense of dread must have been palpable. And amidst all the rumors and fear, one name kept surfacing.
Oh.
Lance Jeffrey Voss.
And who was he?
A local teacher, a father.
So you wouldn't typically suspect.
Exactly. But there were whispers, suspicions.
What kind of suspicions?
He had connections to the Lewiston Civic Theater.
The same theater where 3 of the victims were last seen.
The very same. And rumors about Voss's past began to circulate. People were asking questions, trying to piece together the puzzle.
Trying to make sense of the unthinkable. So investigators started looking into this Lance Voss.
They did. They were trying to find any connection, any evidence that might link him to the victims.
But that's the challenge with cold cases, right?
Yep.
Years go by, memories fade, evidence gets lost. It's like trying to put together a puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
It's a race against time, and time isn't always on the side of justice. But investigators, they dug into Voss's life.
His alibi.
His past. They were trying to find anything at all that would tie him to the disappearances. But there was no smoking gun. No hard evidence.
So much suspicion, but not enough to make an arrest. So Voss remained a person of interest, but officially, nothing.
Did they ever consider other theories?
They did. They couldn't just focus on one person, especially with so many unanswered questions. Right.
One theory that emerged was the possibility of a transient killer.
Transient killer.
Someone passing through the valley, maybe a drifter, maybe a trucker, someone who could take advantage of the circumstances and then disappear just as quickly.
That makes sense. I mean, the Lewis-Clark Valley back then, it was a hub for loggers, truckers, all sorts of people coming and going.
Right, and without a clear motive, without any physical evidence linking a specific person to the crimes, the transient killer theory, it had to be considered. Especially with Kristi and Kristen, their bodies were never found.
It's like they vanished into thin air.
Exactly. But then there's Brandy, Christina, and Stephen all connected to the theater. Doesn't that point to someone local, someone who knew their routines, someone who knew the area well enough to dispose of the bodies?
It's another piece of the puzzle, isn't it? And investigators looked into that possibility, too.
They did. The thought being someone maybe had a grudge or maybe some sort of obsession. But if it was someone local, wouldn't they have tried to hide the bodies better? Brandy and Christina, they were found relatively close to town.
It's possible the killer panicked. Maybe they didn't have a plan or they got spooked and just wanted to get rid of the bodies quickly.
So it's like we have these two competing theories. The transient killer taking advantage of the valley's transient nature.
Versus someone with a more personal connection to the victims.
And neither theory could be ruled out completely. No concrete answers, just more questions. And as the years passed, those questions became harder and harder to answer.
Time. It's the enemy in these cases. Evidence disappears, memories become unreliable, witnesses move away, pass away.
And the families of those who vanished, they're left with this agonizing uncertainty. Will they ever know what happened to their loved ones? Will they ever get justice?
The not knowing, it can be a heavy burden to carry. And in a case like this, with no resolution, the families are left with this profound sense of powerlessness.
Some families, they choose to move away from the valley, unable to bear the constant reminders, the whispers, the speculation, while others, they stay, determined to keep the memory of their loved ones alive, hoping that someday, somehow, the truth will come to light.
It's a testament to the strength of the human spirit, isn't it? That even in the face of such tragedy, there's still that glimmer of hope.
But after all this time, is there really any chance of finding new leads? Is there a chance that this case could ever be solved?
Well, technology has advanced so much in recent years. What might have seemed impossible a decade ago could be possible now.
You're talking about things like DNA analysis.
Exactly. DNA technology has revolutionized the way we investigate crimes. We have techniques now that can extract DNA from the tiniest of samples. We can even predict a suspect's physical appearance based on their DNA.
So even though these crimes happened decades ago, there's a chance that new forensic techniques could uncover new evidence, new clues.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's not just about new technology. It's about revisiting old evidence with fresh eyes, re-examining witness statements, maybe even re-interviewing people who were involved in the original investigation.
And with all the renewed interest in cold cases these days, with documentaries, podcasts, true crime shows, Maybe someone out there remembers something.
Some detail that seemed insignificant at the time, but now could be the key to breaking the case wide open.
It's a thought that gives you chills, isn't it? That someone somewhere might hold the answer to this mystery. That they might have the piece of information that brings closure to these families.
And that's why it's important to keep these stories alive, to keep asking questions, to keep searching for answers. Because for the families, for the community, and for the sake of justice, we can't allow these cases to be forgotten. It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the families, the ones left behind.
I know, it's been on my mind throughout this whole deep dive.
That not knowing, that constant wondering.
Can you imagine living with that every single day?
It's like a wound that never heals.
And in these cases where justice is still out there, it's got to feel so helpless, like there's nothing you can do.
And yet some of these families, they turn that pain, that anger into action.
They become advocates, they raise awareness, they support other families going through the same thing, they fight for change. It's really inspiring.
It is. To see that kind of strength in the face of such tragedy, it reminds us that even in the darkest of times, hope and resilience can still shine through.
And it's not just the families directly affected, right?
No, it's the whole community.
The friends, the neighbors, everyone who knew these young people.
And even those who didn't, they still feel the impact.
That fear, the uncertainty, it changes the way people live, the way they interact with each other.
It's a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, darkness can exist.
And it can leave a lasting scar.
It's a reminder that behind every case file, every headline, there are real people, real lives that have been shattered.
And we can't forget that. As we discuss these cases, as we try to make sense of the senseless, we have to remember the human cost.
We have to approach these stories with sensitivity and respect, to acknowledge the pain and the loss that these families have endured.
So to all our listeners out there, remember the victims, Kristi, Kristen, Stephen, Brandy, Christina. Their stories may be shrouded in mystery, but their lives had meaning. They were loved, they were missed, and their absence left a void in this world.
And if you have any information, anything at all that could help shed light on these cases, please come forward. No detail is too small. You might hold the missing piece that could finally bring closure to these families.
The Lewis Clark Valley may seem quiet now, but the echoes of these tragedies are still felt. Let's hope that someday those echoes will be replaced by the sound of answers and a community finally finding peace. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.